One of the most commonly used and misused tool relative to the quail management is the cow. Grazing management can be an important positive or an important negative in the overall scheme for quail management. So let's discuss what some of those pros and cons are. On the plus side, on the pro side, cattle can do a couple of things for you quite well. They can set back plant succession. So in other words, the plants that we like to see for good food production, things like snow on the mountain, western ragweed, broomweed, some of those plants, as a stand of grass gets grazed down by cattle, it frees up some of those early successional plants. I'd refer you to a video we got called Plant Succession to learn about that process. Another thing that cattle grazing can do to you is if you've got grass that's too thick, and grass can get too thick for quail. If you don't have a certain amount of bare ground on the soil, that quail can get around on, find seeds, ease of travel, grass can get too thick. Now that's rarely a problem for us here in West Texas, but it can happen. You got to keep in mind that we live in a situation here in West Texas that is typically 20-25 inch rainfall zone, that 6 out of 10 years receive less than average precipitation. And so we've got to think about, are cattle an asset to us? Are they a liability to us? And if they're an asset but they become a liability, how do we adjust for that? So this can be one of the more contentious aspects of quail management here in West Texas because cattle grazing, cattle ranching is the primary use of the land. And it's not by accident that that predominant land use, grazing, coincides with good quail habitat. So we're fortunate here in West Texas and South Texas that grazing can be very compatible with quail management. But we seek ways, how can we optimize that relationship? And so we'll talk about some of the pros and the cons and how we can minimize the negatives and accentuate the positives. Now, I don't mean to be too negative on the cow side, but again, if 6 years out of 10 are below normal precipitation, then odds are more years out of that 10-year cycle, cows will be a bit of a liability to you as a quail manager. There's lots of land in West and South Texas that the quail lessee just goes ahead and leases the grazing too because he realizes with very little grass, there's very few quail. Now, there are some pros to this, and I always preface my discussion on cows and quail by saying this. A rancher with bird dogs is the best friend that a quail has. Think about that. A rancher with bird dogs is the best friend a quail has because as he's contemplating stocking rates for his livestock, as he's contemplating brush management, he's also enjoying that quail hunting. So he has a vested interest in the final product. I wish that every rancher in West Texas owned a bird dog relative to that. Some of the cons relative to grazing is basically competition with quail. Now you might think, whoa, Rollins, cows don't eat the same thing that quail do. Cows eat grass, quail eat seeds and insects. Well, they don't compete for food, but they compete for fodder. That grass is important to the cattle for grazing, but it's important to the quail for nesting. So one of the real evils, if you will, from a quail standpoint is that we've got country that doesn't have sufficient nesting cover. I like to think of good quail habitat as having at least 300 suitable bunch grass clumps per acre. You ought to be able to sit on your horse and throw your lariat from one clump of bunch grass to the next, that kind of density. If we don't have that, that tips the odds of the nesting quail into the odds of the prowling coyote. So we want to create a situation where quail are favored by our management and not hindered by our management. Another concern, hypothetically, is nest trampling. If we've got more cattle out there, are we going to lose some quail nests because of the trampling by the hooves? That's not likely to happen. We did some studies 30 years ago, and it takes a lot of cattle, about 80 head per acre, that kind of stock density before you'd worry about nest trampling being concerned. So really not a big factor, but the loss of nesting cover can be a huge factor. Now, different people will argue for a deferred rotation grazing system, a high intensity, low frequency, a savory grazing method, holistic grazing management. There's a number of different methods and means by which you can move cattle around. If one of those works for you, I'm all for it as long as it meets my minimum criteria, and that is 300 basketball-sized bunch grasses per acre. I can do that with a light continuous stocking. If I had designed a stocking program that I think would be best, it would be just a continuous stocking at a very light stocking rate. That way I'm maximizing animal performance. I'm getting a little bit of spot grazing, but hey, that ain't all bad through the eyes of a quail. But I don't care what kind of grazing method or management system you use, as long as it meets those criteria for suitable nesting cover. Now, a lot of people are going to construe what I'm saying as Rollins said you can't have cows and quail at the same time. I'm not saying that. You can have cows and you can have quail at the same time, but you cannot maximize both simultaneously. There's going to be some trade-offs. And the astute manager needs to say, if this is my climate situation, if I'm at the end of a 3-year drought or I'm at the end of a 2-year wet spell, my grazing management has to change. I have to be flexible in my stocking rates, because stocking rate is the key component of that grazing equation. And do I need a cow per 10 acres or a cow per 110 acres? That's dictated by the climate, by the site, by the soil type. A lot of things go into that, but you need to know what your grazing potential is. Your NRCS people can help you determine that, and there's a lot of information out there on that subject. One of the things that, as a quail manager and somebody who talks a lot about quail, I ask landowners, cattle ranchers, to think about this. There is a database in Texas called the Standardized Performance Analysis Database. Our ag economist at Texas A&M came up with it 20 years or so ago. It's called a SPA database. Using the data that they've obtained in this SPA database, they can look at your situation and say, if your wintering costs are such and such, if your weaning rate is such and such, then the odds of you being able to operate in the black at a profit are such and such. Based on those data, about 75% of the cow-calf producers in the state of Texas net less than $40 per cow. Net less than $40 per cow. If we're at a stocking rate of 20 acres per animal unit, which would be too heavy for Fisher County, 70% are netting less than $2 an acre from that grazing enterprise. And I use that kind of data to say, if you had good quail hunting, what would it be worth? Could you market it for $2 an acre? You can market it for anywhere from $2 to $8 an acre. The point being that there are other uses out there, and maybe quail should be the primary land use for that piece of ground. Using cattle as a tool, but not necessarily being married to the cow in that situation. You got to be flexible. You got to be ready to, if we go into a dry spell, you got to cut your herd by 50%. You got to have the means to do that. Some people will graze half of their grazing capacity with cows, the remainder with stocker cattle, so they can liquidate those stocker cattle. Be flexible. Your land will show it. Your quail population will show it. One of the really important considerations in this cow-quail equation are where are you at in the state of Texas. Here in Fisher County, we're in about a 21-inch rainfall zone. Cows can be plus or minus, and again, most years are going to receive less than average precipitation. If we go to Pecos County, out in the Trans-Pecos, average rainfall may be 10 inches. Proper stocking rate might be 6 or 7 cows per section. So again, if I go to Victoria, 45-inch rainfall zone, cows are going to be much more useful to me as a quail manager in Victoria than they are in western Fisher County, because of that inherent rainfall gradient and the more productive grass growing situations further east than they are further west. So I hope you can see that grazing is a double-edged sword. It can cut for you or it can cut against you. And as a quail manager, again, we're not wanting to just have cows and quail at the same time. We're asking ourselves this question: how can cattle be used as a tool to sculpt quail habitat? That's going to mean we've got to be a little bit creative, perhaps lower stocking rates, perhaps something like patch burn grazing, some different ways to induce some limited spot grazing on that landscape so we get different plant communities growing up. There's a lot of ways to be creative in that situation. And as the manager, you got to ask yourself, how important are quail to me versus how important are cattle to me? Adjust your goals depending on what that analysis reveals.